thank you very much for coming here tonight. We have the opportunity to discuss remarkable authors from Italy and authors that really were outstanding at that time. And I'm so grateful to Anne and Jenny, who worked hard to translate these writers, Alba de Céspedes, Elsa Morante, Natalia Ginzburg also, that is going to be part of the conversation. You know, they're an amazing author. And these three authors that were intellectuals that really set the tone for a conversation that is still not over today. I'm saying something more about these three authors. All three wrote and grew up also, despite their international relations, the international experiences, especially Alba de Céspedes, who was born in Cuba, out of diplomats, and so they really were part, in a way, especially the Céspedes, of the jet set of the time. What was the ideal of Europe, but then a Europe that was going beyond, there was a cosmopolitan idea. With that said, they were also part, and they grew up during the ventennio of the fascist regime. To abide to roles that were prescribed, and there were prescriptions for the roles of men and women, and a specific place in society. They resisted that. They resisted that completely in their own way. Alba de Céspedes will become, after Second World War, the director of Mercurio, the most forward-thinking and also the most open-minded of the journals of Italy after the conflagration of the war and after fascism. Natalia Ginzburg will become a part of the publishing house Einaudi. And Einaudi was really the publishing house where intellectuals shared ideas, and they wanted to build a new country with progressive ideas. And she was a protagonist in that situation. And Elsa Morante is difficult to frame because she was possibly the best Italian writer of the last century. And really, her books are still today, they provoke heated debate. I know possibly her most successful book, History, a novel, that is History, a novel that talks about a poor woman in Rome during the Second World War and during the resistance, is now in Italy a successful TV series. And again, as when the novel came out in the 70s and is still today, it polarizes attention within the left, I would say, but also within the broader spectrum of politics, of debate, in general, intellectual agendas in Italy. So just to provide a little frame, and I know that Anne is translating history, so soon we're going to have you with this amazing novel that really stands out within the broader question that are with Italian literature, European literature at that time. All these authors were references for Elena Ferrante. That read them avidly. She said at a certain point that Lies and Sorcery really made her change her mind regarding literature. These novels and these books are complex. They talk about living and surviving a regime, despite they never address overtly the problem of being a woman during the regime. You can read between the lines. You can find some of the characters there that are still living and oppressed by a mentality that was before fascism and will be even after fascism. However, all these books have been written in the 40s. So Elsa Morante again said, becoming a writer is also an act of maturity, and for me the act of maturity, and when I faced reality, the dream broke down like it was a mirror that shattered into little pieces, was the war. And this book is full of the war, despite the war is never mentioned, and actually takes place in the early 20th century in Palermo and in Sicily. So it's very interesting how they were able to use mirrors to reflect their own experience, and especially the experience of women that grew up in a totalitarian regime, but that they were nonetheless able to find their way. Just last little remark, because before we move on and we hear Jenny and Anne saying something and also reading from their beautiful translation, is the fact that a lot of these writers were outstanding at that time. But what I find amazing of them is that they know perfectly that their situation of women that were outstanding were able to publish. They were in the, like this has been in European diplomacy because of her family, but also like Elsa Morante, and that was able to discuss with the best writers of the time. She was famously married with Alberto Moravia, who was one of the, how can I say, the figures, the literary figures of the 20s and 30s that the regime, the fascist regime, like ostracized. First, it was pigeonholed for being Jewish, of course, and even the fact that Elsa Morante was Jewish was a big part in the exclusion in certain circles. So they knew very well that they were, in any way, they were part of a privileged society. And what I found amazing is that they very often write about women. They were not part, and they were unable to go beyond the stereotypes of their time, of the mentality of their time, but also of living in a repressive regime. Okay, I leave it there because I hope this will provoke some consideration, but I think the best reflection will come out after hearing Anne and Jenny read their beautiful translation.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say, Franco, that Franco has an incredible book called Against Redemption, Democracy, Memory and Literature in Post-Fascist Italy, which I actually read very closely in order to write my introduction. So thank you so much, Franco. I'm so happy that you're here. I think we're going to do our readings first, is that right? So do you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess it's chronologically first.
There you go. There's a reason.
Thank you all for being here. I'm actually going to read from De Céspedes. De Céspedes was in Rome when the Germans occupied Rome in 1943. She was living in Rome with her partner, and she, at a certain point, she decided that she could no longer stand to be in Rome under the German occupation. She wasn't Jewish, her partner wasn't Jewish, but they decided to flee and to try to get to the south. And in order to do that, they had to cross the German lines. At the same time, the Allies were just landing in the south of Italy, and they were making their way north. And so there's this whole tension of when are the Allies going to get here? They left Rome thinking that the Allies were about to get there, and they were going to be, staying in the countryside for a week or two, which turned out not to be the case. So they fled, and they left. They went to, they were heading through a route, so they were going to stay there. And meanwhile, the Germans got closer and closer. So they ended up basically spending about 5 weeks in the woods before they were able to cross the line. So during this time, they were sort of living with nothing, she managed to keep a little diary. She had a notebook that she wrote in, and this is just a little bit of a few pages from her diary, not exactly consecutive, but it doesn't really matter. It was, maybe I should also say, it was the fall, so the weather wasn't too great. October 18th. We've been here now for 5 days. We're sleeping in a hut that's half stable, half woodshed, with straw pallets on the ground, and at night we light a fire. A broken down door barely hides a view of the sky. It's very cold. Each of us sleeps wrapped in a blanket. Even our heads are wrapped to warm ourselves with our breath. 7 men are sheltered in this stable. I'm wearing pants and live with them like a comrade. This is a couple days later. Tonight we were all up at 4, ready to flee. False alarm. It was a French prisoner passing through the fields. I think when she says prisoner, she means an escaped prisoner. And a farmer fired in the air. Last night, while we were gathered around the fire at Tricolori's farm, we heard shots nearby and women's voices crying for help. A farmer arrived running with the message, "It's the Germans, they're shooting." With Aldo and Franco, I rushed down the slope above the stream, the branches and briars dense, almost impenetrable. Behind us, a woman's crying could be heard, the lament of Sophia, who was calling her husband. Around us, other refugees were fleeing. A Russian shouted, "Where are you? Help me," and risked getting us all discovered. I could have killed him to shut him up. Down the steep embankment to the stream, grabbing a tree trunk scratched by thorns through the creaking thicket of branches. We exchanged words muffled by fear. Off with the raincoats, they're too pale, they can be seen in the shadows. Like blind men, we went into the stream. The freezing water came to our knees. We crawled up the wooded embankment opposite on all fours. In the midst of the terrible fear, I remembered stories I read as a child, the jungle stories. At every step, you had to extricate your foot from the tangled vegetation of the undergrowth, make a pathway with your hands, eyes closed so that the thorns wouldn't wound them. Franco's eyes were protected by his glasses. At times, I had a suspicion that we were doing all this for fun. I, Alba, couldn't truly be in such a grave situation, on the point of being captured by German soldiers, shot, killed. The entire experience seemed stronger than me, than my capacity to endure. Whereas at other times, in the silent, insidious darkness, the danger seemed to me so close that there was no escape, no possibility of flight. It was over, we'd been captured. The grim, distant barking of a dog made my distress more acute, and over all was the humiliation of having to flee like a criminal, sampling the life of a murderer or thief, though I had committed no crime, only dreamed that my own country could be free and civilized. Some 2 hours in the woods, cold. Occasionally we'd start moving again, climbing uphill to get warm. All around were the innumerable sounds of the nocturnal life of the forest, the voice of an owl, a slow rustling in the dry leaves, a darting among the branches. The three of us sitting on the ground waiting. Finally, we heard a distant low whistle, the whistle of friends. It was as precious as suddenly recovering the taste of life. I have one more. Should I keep going?
Yeah.
This is closer to a few weeks later, I guess. Or maybe not. I can barely write in this shoddy, beat-up notebook. I have to take it with me every time there's an alarm. It's unwise to leave it in the stable. Tonight it was crushed between two plants near the cave dug by Tricolori. Yesterday evening at 6, the alarm. We fled to that cave, Franco and I alone, with the blankets over our shoulders. We were buried in the darkness. Franco had a very high fever. He was trembling as he lay in the gloom of the cave. A profound and tenacious dampness rose from the earth despite the blankets. No sound except the tumbling of the stream, which at first seemed to us a hoarse drum roll. We went back up after 2 hours. The Germans are getting closer. The circle tightens. This morning we were in alarm for 3 hours, first in the cave, then in the woods. We were reduced to nearly nothing. Franco has a fever. They pass. The preceding journal entry was interrupted because of an alarm. The Germans were very close by. We fled into the woods, Franco feverish and extremely weak. We have no water, our underwear is torn. We have to jealously conserve the fire under the ashes because we have no more matches to light it. The men are exasperated by the lack of cigarettes. Carmine, Tricolori's son, got hold of some tobacco leaves. They crush them and then roll the tobacco in the German language leaflets that the RAF pilots drop over the lines. We're exhausted. The English are still distant, 5 kilometers from Vasto, it's said. Meanwhile, the Germans are sacking the villages all around. Tonight it was Montenero Domo's turn. Life has never been so serious for me, only there's a great sweetness in the innocent candor of Aldo, who regrets not having a cake today for his birthday. Soon even the comfort of writing these notes will end. I have no idea how to get another notebook. Anyway, she did get another notebook. They did cross the lines. They crossed the Sangro River, and got to Bari, where she worked as a radio announcer for a partisan radio.
Okay, so as Franco said, and as I say in my introduction, although fascism is nowhere in this book mentioned because it takes place prior to it, fascism is really on every page here, and resistance to fascism. So in that spirit, I thought, okay, well, if I'm saying that, I should just open up the book and it'll be on any page. So I did do that, and so I'm going to read to you from the middle of the book, and it's where Rosaria, who's a very significant character in the book, the book is narrated by Elisa, who's sort of an alter ego of Elsa, and Rosaria is a very important person to Elisa, and it's when Rosaria first meets Francesco, who is Elisa's father, but this predates Elisa's birth. So Rosaria has come from the countryside, and she's come to Palermo, we're not sure, it's called P, the city, but somewhere in the south. And she's come to the big city, and she is living with a relative who has a hat shop. And she gets bored of the hat shop and starts doing silly things, and her aunt kicks her out. And so she goes to a friend who's a courtesan. And so began Rosaria's immodest life. At first, the men she met were traveling salesmen of little account, clerks, policemen, or laborers. She sometimes gave herself in exchange for a dinner in a tavern, a pair of shoes, or a fake pearl necklace. She didn't know yet about luxury, carriage rides, and elegant neighborhoods, but her meager pleasures and trinkets seemed grand and splendid to her. A small glass of Mistra or aquavit was enough to get her drunk, and she would then sing, laugh, and take off her clothes like a burlesque dancer. In her sensual voice, she would say, in dialect, words of endearment or raunchy and secretive things. She liked all these men who came and went, but didn't love any of them. She was both maternal and passionate with all of them, but few of these trysts lasted more than a single evening. It was as if she had just one lover, and his name was desire. Her desire for kisses and vices, the heat of passion, becoming embodied by one or another of those transitory lovers. This was the state of her life. Not even 2 months had passed since she'd left the hat shop. When, like an archangel, Francesco appeared. He introduced himself as a baron, and he was, moreover, a cultured young man, a student, and in short, the first gentleman she'd ever met. No one had loved her with such zeal and chivalry. Even the scars that deformed his face were a source of love for her, since they made a man who otherwise would have seemed too far above her accessible, allowing him to enjoy her compassion and maternal sentiments. Thanks to her humble position and trust in him, Francesco, whenever in her presence, was liberated from all timidity and pride. When they were together, he felt a natural confidence in himself that came from knowing he was admired and adored, as well as from that sense of abandon born of pleasure's happy harmony. Rosaria blindly believed everything he said, not because she wasn't clever, but because she was uneducated and worshipped him. She listened to him with wide eyes full of wonder when he told her about all the estates, forests, and horses owned by the De Salvi family that he would one day inherit. He told her about the hunts, the coat of arms bearing red lions on fields of gold, and about his legendary ancestors. And since she couldn't read, on his visiting card he pointed out to her the small crown printed over his name, Baron Francesco de Salvi. She gazed admiringly at the little crown, as if it were magical and irrefutable proof that he came from another world. No matter how exalted he'd become in her eyes, she maintained her habitual amorous familiarity with him, since it was her nature to feel united as one with her lover, whether or not he was the king himself. Right from the start, Francesco devoted himself to getting her to renounce her immodest adventures, using the eloquence suddenly available to him whenever he abandoned himself to his emotions, and staring at her with velvety eyes full of compassion, he explained to her that she was a victim of bourgeois society, a monster feeding off the likes of her, only then to spit her out into the garbage. He wanted to introduce his lover to the plans for a future society in which human dignity, freedom, and reason reigned. But just as he loved to appear fabulous in her eyes, boasting of glories, wealth, nobility, of which he was contemptuous in his usual arguments, he now didn't hesitate to make use of the mythologies he'd long since rejected in his heart to enlighten her childish mind. In a stern, almost Orphic tone of voice, he told her that she was living in sin, condemning her soul to eternal damnation, and would wind up in hell. Rosaria wasn't pious. Her religion was limited to a superstitious cult that worshipped a few sacred images and symbols, in addition to a blind faith in fortune tellers and cards. But for her, Francesco's every word was dogma and prophecy. The warm, harmonious voice of her young preacher, the rays of light coming from his black eyes, his wise and poetic expressions deeply moved her. She was proud to learn that she was a victim and pitied herself. The threat of hell filled her with terror, and for all these reasons, she burst into tears and sobs. She began to kiss Francesco's hands while muttering, "I kiss your hands." She then remembered the Apostles' Creed, and in a broken voice in her fantastical language, she stammered that yes, she'd been buried in hell, but he, like Jesus Christ descending on the third day, had stolen her away from hell and brought her to the heights of paradise. For Francesco, she would forego all her vices, whims, and cravings, promising him that from that day forth she would live according to his will. Francesco then covered her in kisses, and her sobs became sighs.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's the best introduction to two stunning books that are, however, very complex. Because we already, Céspedes, with Céspedes we have like the story that is determined by urgency of escaping the fascism, escaping Rome that is about to be occupied by the Nazi in a dire moment of Second World War. So the diary has a totally different regime. You read it with a certain kind of freshness because you don't know what's next. On another hand, you have here a novel that you see there are layers and layers of culture, of thinking, rethinking, and of complexity of characters. They equal other characters and still can say something about, in a flowery way, in a very, very flowery way, can say something, with the language of romance, can say something about the actual condition of women, especially in the south of Italy in this case, because that is at the very center of the novel. Again, we were talking about this novel because there is an urgency, and I love the fact that we had so different genre to start with. And I would like to, you did an amazing job translating these books, I know, but as a fact. But I would like to ask you why you choose this novel and this the diary, why you pick up especially these passages as relevant for your work as a whole.
Okay, so you spoke earlier, Franco, about the sort of restrictiveness of women and their and how Morante is really sort of pointing that out a lot. And the whole novel is really about it's about how our institutions, our culture, our traditions, everything are constantly going toward a sort of oppression. And that until we sort of examine that and look at that and how that works in society, fascism will just keep coming back. So what she's doing is she examines very much on a very specific personal, because it's very personal, it's sort of auto-fiction in its own way, what she just lived through. And she does this through mirroring with all of the different characters, how women's lives are, they're so restricted, and they have very little choices because of these institutions, and and how they navigate that. And that's what and so I thought this little bit showed a little bit how Rosaria navigated that.
De Céspedes, in a way, is doing the same thing, but she's doing it a little bit more overtly. Her women are current, they're modern they live at the time that she's living, more or less. But they're struggling with the same things. They're struggling with restrictions, with oppression, with how do I become myself? De Céspedes herself was constantly she was a great diary writer. Well, you can see she was a great diary writer. She kept diaries all her life. But she struggled a lot with the idea of being. She was married. She had a son. Well, it's complicated, but anyway. But she struggled a lot with the fact that she was supposed to be a wife, but she wanted to be a writer. And her husband, she thought, was not exactly sympathetic. It's the whole plot of not these books, of her side of the story, is about a wife who wants to be a person, and her husband, who she thinks is a fabulous anti-fascist professor who works in the resistance. He does all kinds of heroic things, but she is nevertheless the wife, and it turns tragic.
Ginzburg's family lexicon points to that a lot, about because it's written against this backdrop of the encroaching fascism,
right?
And it's also the story, a very domestic story of her and her family, and a very oppressive father. And so these things are kind of mirroring each other as they go along. Even though he's extremely anti-fascist, the whole family is anti-fascist. The brothers go and fight in the resistance, but the focus on the sort of female condition and what's happening in the domestic sphere is never considered. And this is what these women writers are considering.
Yeah, I mean, in De Céspedes and her other books, the fascist aspect, the fascist background is not really talked about overtly, but it's there, and it's there, as you say, in the whole pattern of how women are treated and what their limitations, the structural limitations for them, and how people try to get out of them.
Yeah, and another point that I would make is just that, again, we tend to see fascism, when these things happen, the regimes come, we tend to see them as anomalies, even though we see them again and again and again.
Yeah.
They're other. And it's, oh, we can't have that happen again, and then it does. But what these women are saying is, and this is, I think, why Morante absolutely set her book pre-fascism, is that it's in the DNA of our social structures, and that's what we have to look at, not setting up laws or changing things because of what happened during fascism, but what is in our society that is allowing it to happen again and again.
Well, maybe I can just add something to, even providing some context about these books, because that says a lot about how this amazing author tried to work out their own experience, their life experience. Well, just to say something, Alba de Céspedes in Rome in 1944, Italy was still not liberated yet, but only parts of Italy were liberated. The north was still under Hitler's yoke, and intellectuals were flocking to Rome, and she was able to open an amazing journal that really could encompass the totality of even political ideas, which was something very difficult at that time. She had collaborators from every side because they trusted her. And she did, and one story of Mercurio, basically that's the name of the Greek god, is that every time there was a big intellectual coming and visiting the office, you can imagine in early post-war. Actually, 1944 Rome, the office was probably like 2 rooms. Like, oh, that's amazing. But talking with her, I was like, oh, that's amazing that you do this job here, but who's the director? And she was like, I am the director. And that was a kind of interesting story, because before we mentioned the housewife, a few years before, Paolo Mazzino, another great Italian writer, wrote Death and Life of a Housewife, an amazing magical realist novel. And then it was republished, because during the fascist regime, that novel, that was talking exactly about what you mentioned, Jenny, was censored, put aside. It could go in different, as a feuilleton, different parts of it, but not as a volume. And Paolo Mazzino was also part of this discussion among women. And again, we were discussing earlier how in the pages of this journal that was created by the Céspedes, Natalia Ginzburg intervened, and there was one of the first open discussion about, I would say, feminism, the role of women in society, and women in writing in liberated Italy. I don't know, Anna, you were talking about that before, because you read it, and I read it in me, but if you want to say something about that.
Well, there was sort of a disagreement between, Ginzburg wrote about, she wrote a lot about, part that I remember mostly is she wrote a lot about having children and the importance of having children. And it was, so that was, you know, I don't know. Anyway, she wrote about, I mean, what de Céspedes said is, Ginzburg was sort of saying we need to tiptoe around the subject of our oppression in a way. And de Céspedes was saying that we need to, she called it a well. Well, actually, that was Ginzburg's. She said we have to go to the bottom of the well and then get what we can out of it, and then take it back up to the top. And so they had a little bit of a disagreement.
Yeah.
But they were, I mean, I guess they were acquaintances.
That was published in the New York Review of Books not that long ago, right?
Yeah, like about
A year ago, yeah, really interesting. I mean, again, that's always really, de Céspedes was absolutely avid feminist. I mean, she,
Yeah,
which was great, I mean,
Yeah.
so great. But Ginzburg would never say she was a feminist, and yet all her work is so deeply feminist. So I've always thought about that a lot and tried to, and Morante didn't want to be called a feminist either.
That's right.
And yet they were so feminist. And I think it has a lot to do with identity politics, probably, and just not wanting to be identified with any ism, you know, coming out of fascism. But it's always, I've thought a lot about that and why they were so resistant to the term.
Yeah, which is very, very interesting for retrospective. You know, history of not just what happened in Italy, but what happened to the, you know, intellectual in general, and you know, figures that wanted to be first of all intellectuals and speaking. I mean, Morante, this is like a pun in Italian, but basically, in Italian, if you are a poet, you can be poeta masculine and poetessa feminine. And she was like, no, I'm a poeta, which is like this sort of ambiguity, because it's like, it doesn't matter whether I'm male or female. I want to be part of a discussion that doesn't, you know, set up labels. And in fact, even when I was in college, I remember the chapters on women writers in Italy, 20 pages after 30 pages of Calvino, 40 pages of Pasolini, and so on and so forth. So she didn't want that. She really was trying to get out of that label, because, I mean, you know, even for a personal, not revenge, but just like a sense of what she's been doing. And this novel, when Licensed Sorcery, Jenny translated, when it came out, it was, she was like, okay, this should be the last novel ever. So you see also, from this perspective, also the ambition of these women that really came out of a situation where ambition was not part of their education, they were not allowed to be ambitious. And I would like to go back to what you said before, Jenny, about resistance, about everyday life, because this novel talk about something else. Even within in the 40s, everything was about new heroes against the Nazis, against the fascists. And this book instead does something else. Tell about Elisa, who finds a room on her own to talk about the family, and you know, the odds of escaping, and the cake, as you were mentioned before. So this part of their narrative, I would like you to comment on this. Maybe we can discover something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's very true in Forbidden Notebook too.
Yeah.
I mean, there is that resistance in the sneaking of her, you know, finding a voice in her writing in the notebook, but also that's Elisa has to disappear into her little room in order to find a voice. I mean, the book ultimately, I think, is really about a woman writer finding her voice, and as is the de Céspedes. Just how they go about it, and how they do that and use their voice as a writer to resist the oppression that they are experiencing as women, but also as anti-fascists. You know? So I think it's just kind of brilliant how they bring it into the domestic sphere to make that point, because that's not being done by any of the men. And these writers were amazing. They were so ahead of their time. And then, I mean, we're bringing them back, but
Yeah.
they sort of fell out of favor for a long time. I didn't even know who Alba de Céspedes was, which is like, and I'm, you know, fully immersed in Italian literature, so, I mean, that's,
Yeah, I'm just gonna also say about Alba de Céspedes. Her first novel was, which is the story of 8 young women who come to Rome, and they stay in this kind of residence, which is actually a convent, and they're going to, most of them are going to the university, or they're doing this, or they're doing that, but they're all like different. Each one is different, and but real. But the book was censored. I mean, they weren't the fascist regime did not want to publish it, did not want to allow it to be published, and it was delayed for I think about 3 years. And the publisher, Mondadori, championed it and said we have to publish it. Of course, when it was published, it was incredibly popular. But it had all these ideas of what women could do and be. It has 8 women, 8 protagonists, and each one represents something, a different version of something that the fascists didn't like, or that, you know, sort of the norms of what women should be. It didn't fit the norms of what women should be. So it's a pretty interesting novel.
it's a fantastic novel, and it's coming out in English in September.
No, I don't know. November, October.
November, October. Anyway, soon at Rizzoli near you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, questions?
Do you have questions for our guests? Mm-hmm.
Do we want a microphone there, or?
Shall I pass it?
Hello. Thank you for that terrific lecture. The question, I guess, that's in my mind is, you've talked about how these books articulate the role of women during this fascist period, as well as sort of the particular aspects of what they went through because of the Second World War and the oppression that was unfolding at that time. But if you just take the women's roles during that period of time, could that book, just those elements of that, have been written today in different parts of the world?
Totally.
Absolutely, and that's sort of the point
Yeah.
of these books. That's exactly the point, and why Morante sets hers actually pre-fascism. So the whole idea is really this is not an anomaly under fascism. It's endemic, and we have to look at that. So,
And I think similarly with the Forbidden Notebook, I mean, not everybody, but many people write diaries. I mean, that's just an activity that people have done and do and always will do, and that's also, you know, the many things that happen when you write a diary, I think is also very modern.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you so much for this very interesting lecture. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the public perception of these novels when they were released. Because, you know, Italy had just gone through fascism, or was going through fascism. What kind of conversations did they spark when they were published?
so you could take that one.
Okay, I'm glad to.
Yeah, literary story.
Going back to stage to answer your question. Well, that's a very, very good question, and we try to retrace the debate. Interestingly enough, this book, like, in a way, they came out of favor very, very, very easily in the following years. But in that time, of course, the sparkle debate was big, and both the Céspedes and Morante became important figures. They won prizes, and prizes were debated too, because these books were not easily framed in the level of that time. And we were discussing about the persistence of fascist tenets, but what is interesting, this is the research that I've done, is that if you read the review of the time, especially from progressive outlets, they are saying, yes, but why we're discussing about everyday life, And we're not talking about the resistance and our great heroes. So, you know, and of course, most of these reviews came from a male perspective. So it was very interesting how these books, when they came out, they were successful, and yet they were kind of ostracized even from the progressive writers, you know, the Communist Party in Italy and so on and so forth. Although there were debates about the condition of women and the new vote for women, which became a law in, you know, after the war. And I think this is very relevant because it shows exactly what this book point out and single out, the persistence of this kind of mentality that in which single women can be important, can be like heroes, but the everyday life situations are just not that important for the party, for democracy, for the future, and so on and so forth. Questions?
Thank you. Building upon the two questions that we just heard, do you have any takeaways of how we can learn from these books and all of the wisdom that these authors wrote about how we can apply learnings to our daily lives and the future that we're going towards?
Well, no, I mean, that's a wonderful question because I feel that every day. I'm translating this book, and translating Natalia Ginzburg, which I did, you know, in 2014 or so, and just, you know, pre-Trump. It's just like, oh my God. So, you know, it's such a good question. I think we really have to read a lot them and then really think and reflect on how that is reflective of where we are right now, because I don't think it's that different, frankly. And so instead of looking at these, you know, fascism or whatever as a horrible something other, what are we doing by maintaining our systems, our patriarchy, our hierarchies, our all of those things, and, you know, are clinging to traditions that may be not really good for us. I think we should be questioning all of it.
Hi, I had a kind of a more biographical question, I guess. Maybe I was thinking, not so much in the case of de Céspedes, but certainly in the case of Morante and of Ginzburg, they were in positions of great cultural prestige. And I was in Italy in the 70s, and both Morante and Ginzburg were widely read then. I mean, they were never, de Céspedes is a separate case. But, you know, certainly Ginzburg, you know, Einaudi had power. She was the one who actually rejected Primo Levi's first book, right, saying that Italians were not ready.
And bought Morante's.
Yeah.
First, yeah.
But in the case of Morante, I was just sort of wondering, and her husband, you know, Alberto Moravia, was one of the most, you know, not popular, but powerful, let's say, writers in all of the post-war Italy, you know, up until he died, really. He sort of dominated the literary scene, and I was wondering whether that encouraged or inhibited Elsa's work.
She was often called Signora Moravia, or here, Mrs. Moravia, and she just couldn't stand it. I mean, it drove her crazy. And on when the first translation came out, on the book jacket it said, "And now the first novel from Mrs. Moravia." Drove her nuts. Yeah, so it was a double thing. You know, it was great because she had a lot of, and also she was very close with Pier Pasolini, so she had a lot of access. But as Franco was pointing out, it's okay for women to be single successes, and the exception to the rule. But we're not changing the rules, and they were looking to change the rules, and I think they came up against that again and again.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yeah. Just
Please.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to tell you curiosity about it, because I was very pleased to hear about Alba Céspedes here, because basically nobody known her, meaning she was not, I'm Italian, I grew up in Italy, ferocious reader, we grew up with Elsa Morante, we know about Ginzburg, but Alba de Céspedes was really kind of forgotten, like you said.
Probably because she was such an avid feminist.
Yeah. Yes, yeah,
Wasn't
exactly.
silent about it.
The curiosity is that she actually just recently, I think less than 1.5 years, republished by Mondadori because Marco Vicchi, who is a Florentine writer who is quite popular in, he invented this investigator, Commissario Bordelli. He started reading Alba de Céspedes after the suggestion of a library guy, a library man. So we get to know, reading Marco Vicchi, this inspector, police inspector, gets so excited about the beauty of Alba that everybody was going to the Mondadori and saying, where can I find this? Because not published for at least 25 years. And only recently, I went back to Italy, I found the 3 or 4 books and I bought them all because you can read the diary first 2 years ago. So she kind of disappeared from the shelves. Honestly, I don't know why, but it's
No, that's
you know,
so
a man
interesting.
brought it- a man
I
brought
do
it back.
want to point out, and
Yeah.
you would probably point this out. I mean, go ahead.
Ferrante.
Elena Ferrante is the
Ferrante
reason any
is the
of all
reason
this
any
is
of this
happening.
But also because, I mean, I had never heard of Alba de Céspedes until, but Ferrante in an essay mentioned her, and I tried to get her books, and it was impossible
It was impossible.
until.
3-4 years ago, you were going to Milano, you will find probably some pamphlet, but never a book. Impossible. But,
Yeah,
you know,
she was a
luckily
huge
she's back.
figure with
So,
Mercurio and all that.
yeah,
Just
luckily
disappeared.
she's back now.
But I don't know why we always say, oh, that's so crazy that she just disappeared. I mean, given that women just disappear all the time and have throughout history, so it's that like surprise that we need to get over.
Question?
Thank you also for this wonderful conversation. This is maybe a difficult question, but how do you or can you account for the appeal of a fascist strongman to so many women? As certainly Mussolini and Hitler appealed to many women.
No, absolutely, but I wouldn't make that exclusively women. I mean, they didn't get to where they got because of women. You know, that would be an interesting story. But yeah, I mean, I thought what I read today kind of pointed that out a little bit. The strong rhetoric, the strong, I am owner of the world, I have all the land, I have everything else. The crown, you know, stick with me and you'll get some of that. I mean, I think that's what women have been contending with a lot. Seeing as they don't have any power of their own, stick to the man who's got the power. And it's been unlearning that, and I still think we haven't unlearned that enough. But that's what they're trying, I think Morante and de Céspedes are trying to say, you know, let's unlearn that and have other pathways for women.
Can I add something to this? Because it is this is actually a very interesting question, and I totally agree that the fact that it's not just a female problem. The novel Lies and Sorcery has a number of themes, but exactly one of the themes that is very, very difficult to accept, but I honestly think it's like really visionary writing, is the fact that how much even religion locates women to certain spheres in ways that you are living with the ghost of male figures. Thinking about going to a convent, and I know the stories that are really haunting the entire book, and all the stories of convents of women that were relegated there with the idea of educating and dressing up a little Jesus Christ that was happening in south of Italy for hundreds of years. And this was like the result of a mentality, in which, for instance, the little books for women after they would get married, they were written by priests. And you understand how much there's like a short circuit of mentality here that all conjure up a situation that is toxic, you know, in the first hand.
I have to ask it, at the risk of really having missed a lot, I just finished reading The Forbidden Notebook. Could you elucidate a little more regarding the connection of fascism and fascistic ideas with that particular story?
Well, I don't think you would say that they're, well, as I said, they're not, it's not overt, but it is written in 1950, 51. So it was about, you know, soon after the end of the war. There's still some vestiges of wartime feelings. But I think that really what it's about is a woman who's oppressed by the structures of the society. And that's sort of the fascist element in a way. I mean, by her husband, by her boss, her children.
And sort of the only way that she feels like she can find any kind of voice is to write in a notebook that she needs to hide.
And secretly, yeah.
I didn't know why she did it.
Because if she expressed herself as having any other desire besides being a mother and a wife.
And in the book, in fact, she's laughed at when she says, in the beginning she says, I bought, you know, she says something about, well, what if I kept a diary? And her whole family laughs at her and said, what would you write? You have nothing to say. I mean, it's kind of, so.
Just to sort of add on to that, it feels a little bit like you see her progression. You see Valeria, right? She is finding her voice and she is coming into her own. But then she sees all of the roadblocks, and she has a moment where you think, oh, she's gonna actually do it, and she's gonna actually live her life. And then you realize, and she realizes, it's ridiculous, I can't do that. There are too many obstacles, and in the end, she reverts. And then so you see the progression, and you see how the oppressive society kind of boxes her into a dead end.
Really, really interesting to me, both in that book and in the Morante, is the relationship between the mother and the daughter, and how the mother wants so badly for her daughter to succeed, but because of everything she's learned and knows and is afraid of and everything else, she oppresses her own daughter. In the De Céspedes, it's much lovelier and sort of easier to see. In Morante, it's just vicious. Like, mothers just will destroy the daughters. But it's, I mean, that's part of the oppression, you know.
And in Morante, Eduardo is like, he's almost like the embodiment of fascism.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a human embodiment of it.
Very, very true. I sometimes think he's a little bit Moravia-ish too, because he's so privileged and beautiful and everything else. So, any more questions? Oh, thank you.
Unrelated to these books, I wonder about a new translation of Morante's La Storia. I had heard a rumor, and I'm waiting to
Here I am. Eventually, yes.
No pressure.
Do you want to say anything else to close it?
Absolutely, and I thank you for this question regarding the translation, because I have a question. We can close with a question. I'll just make a remark that, for instance, Lies and Sorcery, that had another title in the first translation, House of Liars, which is something completely different. The first edition, when it was translated in the 50s, this is like an 800 pages book, and 200 pages have been eliminated. And there are all the pages that we are discussing about right now. The ones that are about politics, the ones that are problematic, that show how vicious was the, the relationship mother and daughter, and the fact that we are now translating with with a different competence, but also different passion, these great authors, is remarkable. And I want to just ask you to conclude what, after this experience, what you find especially difficult, but you bring with you out of this work of translating De Céspedes, Morante, and Ginzburg.
That's so not a question to end on. Oh my God, I just love translation. I love everything they teach me. I mean, I don't know what more to say other than, and I think translation is also, I'm a sort of translation activist. I mean, it's a political act. It's a necessary act. If we translated more and read more stories more, I love translation.
Well, I do too. Yeah, and it's always interesting, even when it's difficult. I mean, difficult not just because it's difficult to find the right words, but sometimes it's emotionally difficult, or and it's nevertheless, it's always a good thing to do, and you feel that you're, I mean, it's a little bit banal to say, but you're making connections between worlds, and I think it's important. It's one way we can combat the things we're combating.
Well, now we really conclude. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for coming today.